These are lectures on Christian doctrine by Dr. Joe Sprinkle. The lecture today is the doctrine of the nature of humanity. Are human beings essentially good or essentially bad? Are humans no more than animals with a bit more intelligence than naked ape? Are humans merely biological machines, pawns of the universe, whose behaviors are determined by some combination of their environment, their genetic makeup, and who lack genuine free will? How does the biblical view of human beings differ from that from non-Christian worldviews? Well, according to Genesis chapter 1, human beings are made in God's image, or in Latin is called Imago Dei. Then God said, let us make mankind in our own image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and over the livestock and over all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now, does it mean, what does it mean that we are made in God's image? Well, what it certainly doesn't mean is that we look like God. Mark Twain makes a joke out of this. I was made merely in the image of God, but not otherwise resembling him enough to be mistaken for him by anyone but a very nearsighted person. And to say that we are made in the image of God and that we look like God is a rather silly way of looking at it. But there are other possible meanings of the image of God that do make sense. One way of looking at image of God is to say that there are certain mental and spiritual qualities that make humans like God. Such qualities as reason, intelligence, personality, emotions, free will, self-consciousness, creativity, the ability to make moral choices, the ability to relate to God, our spiritual nature, speech, and so forth. In these ways, we are like God, and in many of these ways, we are different than the animals. I mean, animals show intelligence, but we humans have more intelligence and more creativity and more ability to reason than they. Another possible meaning of image of God is one proposed by Karl Barth. He argues that it's relationships that make humans like God. You have a hint of this where it says, let us make man in our own image in Genesis 1:26. That us may allude to the triune nature of God, that God is Father, Son, and Spirit, and as such, the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, related to one another from eternity past. Humans in God's image similarly relate to one another, and this is symbolized by marriage. God made man in his own image, male and female, he created them. And male and female anticipates marriage. In other words, man does not exist as a solitary creature, but as two persons confronting each other. And this relates to being made in God's image, so Karl Barth argued. Yet another way of looking at image of God has to do with the fact that human beings made in God's image are given dominion over nature. Genesis 1:28, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Genesis 1:28. And so is it dominion over nature that constitutes being made in God's image? Image does have a royal function in the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, kings could come and conquer an area and leave behind not necessarily a standing army, but an image or statue of the political leader, the king, to indicate that they still rule there. You have similar things in totalitarian cultures where images of the ruler are everywhere to remind you that the ruler is watching. You had that of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. You had that of Mao in China, Stalin in Russia. And so it is image could be left behind. Well, God left his image behind in the sense of mankind. Mankind represents God and the rule of God in creation. Mankind rules as God's representative, in other words. You might say that man is God's viceroy. Viceroy is a vice king. And thus man has a mediating position between God and the animals who are under God, but are over the animals as God's representative. Now that means that there's a hierarchy in creation. You have God, who's at the top of the hierarchy, and under God would be the angels, but then lower than the angels would be man or mankind, who are made in God's image, and man has dominion over the other creatures. Psalm 8 celebrates this, that we have been made a little lower than the angels, or a little lower than God, depending on which translation you follow, and have been given dominion over the other animals. Now, those are three different ways of understanding image of God. Can they be combined? And I think yes. Being made in God's image does mean that we share certain characteristics with God, but one of those characteristics is our ability to relate to one another, being relational beings. And so those two can be combined. And our special characteristics which we share with God allows us to relate to God such that we have been given authority over the rest of creation as God's viceroys. So because we share those characteristics with God, we are in a position to serve in that function for God. Well, what are the implications of the doctrine of the image of God? First implication, we have a stewardship over creation. We are given creation and dominion over it, not just to abuse it and destroy it, but to take care of it. Now, it has been given for us to use, and there's a balance between using it and preserving it, but nonetheless, we need to be responsible in our stewardship over creation. Secondly, all human beings have great dignity. All human beings are great because they're made in the image of God. And so no matter how lowly a person may be economically, how depraved a person may be by bad behavior, nonetheless, there's still something great about every human being because they're made in the image of God. And that also means that to kill a human being is, in a sense, to attack God's image bearer and indirectly to attack God. The first command against murder in Genesis 9 and verse 6 makes that point. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. That's Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6. So human beings being made in the image of God means that we should not attack and kill one another. Now, that isn't to say that those who attack are not to be killed by other humans. This does seem to affirm capital punishment for murder. The perfect image of God, though, is the man Jesus Christ. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15, which says of Christ that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Only Jesus is perfectly in the image of God. Francis Schaeffer, who died in 1984, describes the dignity of human beings being made in the image of God in the following quotation, and he's linking it to abortion, which is the taking of innocent human life. He says, but the dignity of human life is unbreakably linked to the existence of the personal, infinite God. Because it is because there is a personal, infinite God who has made men and women in his own image that they have a unique dignity of life as human beings. Human life then is filled with dignity, and the state and the humanistically oriented law have no right and no authority to take human life arbitrarily in the way that it is being taken. I will move on to the next topic. Do humans have component parts? That is, are humans just a body? Or do they have two parts? Do they have a material part and an immaterial part? Or do they have three parts, a spirit, soul, and body? But we will continue that on the next lecture.